Welcome to lab number 2. So today we're going to focus on, actually it's the largest and most diverse division in the plant kingdom. And this division is called Magnoliophyta, but more commonly known as flowering plants. So these are the most recently appearing group of plants on the planet. In contrast to the conifers and the spore producing plants, which we focus on in separate labs. So looking at the flowering plants, we also have an opportunity to really kind of look at plant diversity, to look at some of the special adaptations that this group of plants have evolved, including some plant defenses. So what we're going to spend a lot of time on today is looking around campus here at some examples of flowering plants. We're going to focus a lot on the connection between the flower and the fruit. So often you think that a flower and fruit are separate structures, but one kind of morphs into the other. So we're going to see some really good examples of that. And we're also going to focus a lot on some of the defenses, both chemical and physical, that plants have evolved to protect themselves from predators. So while we're here, I brought out this really ugly plastic model of a very simple flower. So all flowering plants have flowers. The flowers can look really, really different. Some are really showy and smelly, like a lily or a rose. Some are kind of ugly and tiny and don't last very long. I'm going to show you that flowers have reproductive parts, and we'll talk through the basic structures here, but not all flowers have both male and female parts. Sometimes there are separate male flowers and female flowers. So the model here shows about the simplest flower that you can imagine, and then as we walk through campus we'll look at some examples. If you take a botany class or a plant biology class, you'll probably learn a lot about all the different varieties of flowers, all the terminology, and the fruits that they morph into. I hope that everyone's following along with their handout, and what we're doing right now is on the first page of the handout, or section 1. You'll also notice there's a simple diagram, very much like this model, that you can follow along and learn the terms. And we've just included the most basic ones here. So as I mentioned, flowers, sometimes it's separate, sometimes it's the same. This plant model has both male and female structures, and as you learned about in lecture, plants do make egg and sperm just like animals do. They also make spores and they make pollen, so it's important to keep all those straight. So let's focus in on this. So if this was a simple flower like a lily, you might take a cross section of it. What we're looking at here, these yellow structures here, are the male reproductive parts. This is called the stamen. And I remember that because stamen reminds me of stallion, and stallion is a male horse, so that's how I remember. So sometimes I have a hard time. But the stamen itself is composed of 2 parts. The filament, just like a filament in a lamp, this stick that's going to hold what turns out to be the pollen producing part, the anther, up high, and we're going to see why it might project that pollen producing part up. It could either be so that the wind can pick up pollen and move it to another plant, or so an insect or a bird or a pollinator might brush by it. So we're going to see that the stamen is positioned differently in different kinds of flowers. So the anther produces pollen. What does that have to do with sperm? Well, the pollen actually produces sperm. So the pollen will either fly away or be taken by a pollinator and land here in the central part. This is the female reproductive part called the pistil. And in the pistil, at the top here, is a sticky protuberance there. I always remember that because it's called the stigma, and the stigma is sticky for pollen grains. So pollen grains will land on that sticky stigma, and then a pollen tube will form, which will deliver sperm to the ovule or ovary of the plant down here. So it looks kind of like a uterus would in an animal, and it is where the eggs are. So if a pollen grain lands here and produces sperm, the sperm are deposited and may fertilize one or more ovules in the ovary of the plant, deep down in the pistil. And if that happens, then a seed starts to form. Not only does a seed start to form, but often, most of the time, a fruit develops from this ovary. So it sometimes gets swollen and juicy and sweet. It sometimes turns into something that can help transport the seed to another place, like the little maple copters that you see. They're called samaras that you see. Even the fuzz on a dandelion, the fuzz is actually the fruit. So when the ovary, after the egg is fertilized and the seed starts to be produced, any adaptation, any change in that part of the plant that's going to help disseminate the seed is considered a fruit. So we're going to see that fruits are, sometimes you think something is a vegetable, it's actually a fruit. So if it contains a seed and was once a flower or part of a flower, then it technically is a fruit. I didn't mention before that what holds the stigma up in the air so that pollen grains can land is called the style. So it's part of it. A couple other plant structures. The sepal is actually the bud covering. Think of a rose that has sort of that bud covering that stays intact, and that's shown here by these green structures. Sometimes those sort of stay around and sometimes they don't. And of course, flowers usually have petals. Sometimes they're showy. Sometimes there's nectar in the flower, and we're going to talk about that as we look at examples. Flowers that are showy, smell good, have nectar, are there to attract pollinators, so they're there to influence animals. And as humans, we're attracted to flowers also. So when a person buys a flower for someone else, when we plant flowers in our garden, we're actually responding to this beauty in flowers, and we're acting like animals. We're attracted. So within this division, Magnoliophyta, or flowering plants, there are two sort of informal categories that we like to talk about. And it has to do with the pattern of the veins in the leaves. So what I want to talk to you here about is the difference between a monocot and a dicot. And Curt will probably try to trick you in lecture and ask you, is a fern a monocot or a dicot? And you'll say neither, because this is two categories only pertaining to the flowering plants, right? And ferns are not flowering plants. So don't let him trick you on that. So when I say leaf veins are parallel, what do I mean? Well, first of all, you probably never thought of a cattail as a flowering plant, but it is. It's sort of like a giant grass, and grasses are flowering plants too. And in a minute, we'll look at some of the seed heads of grasses to convince you that it really does form a flower, even though that flower is not very showy. So let's look at this. This is kind of like a giant grass. And if you take one of the blades of this giant grass, the leaf, and if you can take it and peel it from tip down to where it attaches to the stem without breaking it, then it's a monocot. The veins in the leaves are parallel to each other. So this is one big division. And from that, if you identify it as such, then you can deduce some other things about this. Now, let me get my cheat sheet so that I remember and get this right. This is all in page 2 of your handout. If it's a monocot, it has parallel leaf veins. But what if you don't have the leaf? What if it had died back and all you had was maybe a flower in your hand, or maybe just the seed? So monocots always have flowers, even though we really can't see those here. In this, it's kind of gone to seed. This is actually a fruit. This cattail thing is actually a fruit, so the flower is gone away. It was here earlier. The remnants of the male flower is actually at the top of the cattail. But we really can't see the flower, but if we did, we could deduce that it would have petals in multiples of 3. That's sort of a hard and fast rule with this group of plants called monocots. If we were able to pull out the roots of this, it would be like a grass, and if you picture pulling up a handful of grass, you know that there aren't tap roots. It's like a fibrous network of roots. So monocots have a fibrous root system. That goes hand in hand with being a monocot. The seeds of this are really tiny, and we'd have to wait till this ripens and matures to find individual seeds. But if we did, we would find that the seed does not split in half like a bean. Think of like a kidney bean that you can split in half. The seeds look more like a grain of corn, like a corn kernel. They're all in one piece. So those things all go together. So if you know it's a monocot, you can deduce something about the flower, about the seed, and about the leaves. So the other member of this grouping is the dicot. So dicot has a branching leaf pattern. So if we look here, probably this would be, think of a maple leaf, but if you can see this, a branching leaf pattern. There's no way you could break it, you could peel it down without breaking through the veins. So it has more like the palm of your hand. So it's a very branched venation pattern. Dicots don't have flowers in multiple of 3s. The flower petals, if we counted them, we would see that they not strictly multiple of 3, 3, 6, 9, etc. And And the seed of this plant would be really tiny, but if we could look at that, we'd see it does break apart. It has two parts, like a bean. So those things go hand in hand. The other thing about the root is that it would have a taproot, like a carrot. Think of a carrot. So if you think of a carrot, do you know anything about a carrot flower? I mean, we've probably seen them, but don't remember. Carrot has a taproot. It is the taproot. So we could deduce that if we could see the flower, it would probably have not multiple of 3. If we could see a carrot seed, we would know that it splits easily in half. So all of those things go all together. But remember, this discriminating monocot and dicot is only for flowering plants, not conifers and not spore-forming plants. So you often don't think of grasses as flowering plants at all, but in fact they are. Even though you can't really think of, you know, where's the flower on this? This is a grass seed head. So actually the grain or the seeds that are produced, we often think of them as grain, think of wheat, is actually the fruit, and a flower was there at one time. As you walk around campus or wherever you happen to be, at this time of year, if you get into an area that isn't mowed, the grasses, we say, have gone to seed, and it's a great opportunity to look at the diversity of grasses that are out there. So the point of this is grasses are flowering plants. They are members of the division Magnoliophyta. They're monocots, right? They have parallel leaf veins. There's a huge diversity. And we want you to think a little bit about why the flower doesn't smell good. It doesn't attract pollinators. So animals love the sweet nectar and the nice smell of flowers. This doesn't have that. So grasses are pollinated by the wind. So depending on whether or not you have a flowering plant, if you have a flowering plant and you smell it and it doesn't smell sweet, it doesn't have pretty colored petals to attract animals, likely it's sort of arranged so that the wind can pick up the pollen and spread the pollen that way. So make a note of that. When you see a flower, a flowering plant, discern in your mind whether you think it is wind pollinated or animal pollinated. And again, with no showy flower, no nice smell, no bright color to the flower, it's probably wind pollinated. And if you do see bright colors and nice smell like we see in the plants behind us, it's probably animal pollinated. And we'll show some examples of some special adaptation of petals that allow certain types of pollinators to interact with those particular flowers. So as I mentioned a minute ago, the cattail is a wetland grass. We talked about that in our first lab of plant biodiversity. We do want you to memorize a few genus names just to remind you that plants do have genus and species name. The genus name of this is Typha, and you can find that on page 3 of your handout. The cattail, genus Typha. Remember, always capitalize and italicize genus names, and if you can't italicize, like when you're handwriting, underline the word. So that's something to get used to. That's the convention in biology. So learn to be professional with that. Okay, here we wanted to show you an example of a wind-pollinated plant that isn't a grass. So sometimes dicots, other types of plants, have wind pollination and not animal. This is actually ragweed, and I'm allergic to it, so I might start sneezing here in a minute. The fact that people are allergic to something like ragweed is a good indicator that the pollen does get in the wind. The wind picks it up. So ragweed has a genus name that is an unlikely name. The name is ambrosia, which sounds like it's something juicy and sweet and wonderful to eat, perhaps, and it's not. Ragweed is kind of ugly and causes a lot of people to suffer. So if you look a little more closely, this is another great example of ragweed has a separate male and female flower. So the male flower, actually, if you look close, looks like little bells that hang down, and the pollen-producing structures are pointed down so that when the wind blows, the pollen drops out. The female flower, it's a whole separate structure that only has female parts to it, is positioned down here at the base, and it's sort of pointed up. So as the wind blows, pollen will drop down into the female flower. So again, this is ragweed. Many people think that they're allergic to something else that blooms at the same time as ragweed, because a lot of times you don't even notice this. It's just kind of green, it's not showy, it doesn't smell good. And often people think that they're allergic to goldenrod because it blooms at the same time. but probably not. We'll look at goldenrod in a minute. We'll see that it has showy flowers. They smell sweet and they attract animal pollinators. So the pollen doesn't get airborne and usually doesn't bother people in the form of hay fever. So what we're looking at here is goldenrod. The genus name of it is Solidago. I always think of sun, and it's yellow. It's the color of the sun. So that's another one that we want you to know the name of. Doesn't take much convincing that this is an animal pollinated plant or flower. Notice all the activity around here at this time. Bees and other insects are attracted to this flower. It has a sweet smell and a bright color. So this is a good example of an animal pollinated flowering plant. Again, goldenrod or Solidago. So there you're looking at a clover flower. So goldenrod as well as clover, even sunflowers and black-eyed Susans, those types of flowers are not single flowers, but they're clusters of flowers. And the term for that is inflorescence. So sometimes flowers have single flowers, a single reproductive structure, a single ovule and anthers, and sometimes they're clusters of many. So the term inflorescence is one to remember. So we're out here by the lake behind the Student Center, and there's a little patch of milkweed. Milkweed is sort of a whole ecosystem. Oh, if come here close, look at this little bug here. That's called a milkweed bug. And you might think, oh, that looks like the same color as a monarch butterfly. So there's a story here with milkweed and monarchs. So monarchs, you know, are sort of endangered. The numbers are declining. They're actually sort of making a comeback. But monarchs' only food is the milkweed plant. It's its ecological niche. So whereas milkweed is poison for most insects, the milky latex that's in it, when you break a leaf, you get the white milky sticky substance leaking out. Not only is it sticky, so it's a chemical defense because it glumps up the mouth parts of insects that might eat it, but it also has toxins in it that only the monarch caterpillar has learned or evolved, adapted to deal with that toxin, so it can detoxify it and store it in its body, and it doesn't hurt the caterpillar. Other caterpillars who try to eat it can't. It poisons them. So the milkweed is the monarch's only food source, and it's one of the only things that can eat milkweed. And monarchs are brightly colored, so you probably know that certain other butterflies, and monarchs are poison themselves. When they pupate and mature into adults, they carry the toxins from the milkweed into adulthood. And birds sort of learn or instinctually will avoid eating a monarch because it is poison. It tastes bad, it will make them sick, and they'll regurgitate them, so they avoid eating monarchs. And other insects have use mimicry, so they've evolved the same color pattern so that birds don't eat them. So to look like a monarch means you're safe from bird predation. So the milkweed has evolved both chemical and physical defenses against predators, but the monarch butterfly has evolved, I call them biochemical defenses. It can sort of sequester and store away that toxin and maybe detoxify it. It also has behavioral defenses. So if you notice, the monarch caterpillar will walk along the central vein prior to eating the leaf and actually nick the central vein, so that when it feeds on the leaf, it blocks the flow of that sticky latex. So instinctively, the caterpillar will do that. So these leaves are all examples of where you see the caterpillar has nicked it, and then it will chew on and eat the leaf right down to that nick and avoid the leaking of that sticky latex. So then if we also want to look at it as a flowering plant, earlier in the summer, the milkweed plant has a kind of a purple cluster of flowers, where now these have been replaced, or those have matured into these milkweed pods. And I can remember like biking along the sides of the roads and just smelling this kind of sickly sweet milkweed flower. So if you look at, there's a photo that Curt actually took this summer when he saw the milkweed flower, and he was trying to figure out where the milkweed pod or the fruit comes from. He caught that right at the right time. So it's a tiny, tiny little flower, and he has a picture of the tiny little, I called them fetal milkweed pods, kind of emanating from that flower. So again, it connects the flower to the fruit. The flower morphs into the fruit. So this is kind of an unusual fruit. It's not tasty to animals. There are seeds in there. When this matures later in the fall, if you look at this area in late October or November, these will have matured and they'll turn brown and they'll pop open and the fuzz will be all over the place. So the milkweed, the silkiness will be out there. So technically there's a little seed at the end, and that fluff, that white fluff, is actually the fruit. So there are many fruits actually contained in this pod. So you never think of fruits as fluff on a dandelion, fluff on a milkweed, but anything that is involved in dispersing seeds is fruit, right? So that can be dispersed by the wind, can be dispersed by animals eating the fruit and pooping out the seeds. So think of fruit as a mechanism of fruit dispersal. So what I'm showing you here is a plant called yarrow. That's the common name, and the genus name is Achillea. And that might remind you of Achilles. If you remember in mythology, Achilles was injured. Someone cut his Achilles tendon, and so he was injured, and he used yarrow to prevent infection. So this is an example of sort of an herb, a smelly chemical defense that actually has medicinal properties. So many plant toxins are used by us for medicines or even to flavor foods. Like the nice smell of basil or oregano or thyme is actually a plant toxin or a poison that's there to prevent animals from being predators on them. But we use those, as I said, in medicine and in cooking. So yarrow, or genus name Achillea. So we're standing here where there's a nice little patch of wild thyme. It has this really pretty purple flower. You can see the bees on it, and it smells really good. This is related to the kind of thyme that's used in cooking, and you could actually pick this and use it. Again, what makes thyme appealing to us is the fact that there's a poison in there to keep animals from grazing on it. So the fuzzy plant that you're looking at is called mullein, or sheep's mullein, and it's a nice example of another physical defense. So that nice soft fuzziness is nice for us to touch, but if you were an animal, an insect, trying to eat the juicy parts of that plant, you would have a hard time getting through all that fuzz down to the juicy parts of the plant. So fuzz on plants is another really good example of a physical defense. So I'm standing here in a salt spray rose bush, also known as Rosa rugosa. Many of you have these at your home, or you see them along the seashore. It's kind of an ornamental. And this is a great example of two things. One, a physical defense. If I move too much, I'm going to get poked with thorns. So thorns on a rose bush is a great example of a defense against predators that plants have evolved. Pretty simple, right? Deer probably wouldn't want to graze on this because the thorns would injure the deer's mouth. The other reason we stopped here is you'll see that the rose is a beautiful kind of a hot pink flower that's very showy. But then it matures, after pollination, it matures into a fruit. And there's some examples of those fruits all around this bush. You might know this as rose hips. It's used in a lot of herbal teas, and it's a source of vitamin C, and it tastes really tangy. So yes, these are edible, especially when they're really ripe. This one's still a little green. This is a great example where you can see the sort of the morphing of the flower into the fruit. So notice the sepals hanging down there below the fruit. You don't often see that on fruit, but that's kind of evidence that that was once the bud cover to the flower that was then pollinated and matured into this fruit. So if you take a botany class or a plant biology class, you'll learn that there are about 30 or more different categories of fruits. They're all intended to, they've evolved or adapted to disperse seeds in various forms, whether that's being eaten by an animal and being pooped out, or being caught by the wind, or even stuck to the hair of a bear if it's, for example, a beech tree. Beech nuts are prickly, so they will attach to animals' fur and then be dispersed. So fruits are all about seed dispersal, and if you remember, fruits always have seeds inside. So we're right here by this apple tree. And I have in my hand a cucumber, and if I had a plum, I would have examples of the three categories of fruits that are very common that we want you to be able to distinguish between and among. So those are drupes, pomes, and berries. And some of this is actually going to surprise you, because what you consider fruits in biology, or you consider vegetables if you're cooking, are actually fruits in biology. And what you might regard as berries are not berries at all to a biologist. An example of that is this cucumber. You think of this as a vegetable, but it's not. It's a fruit. Of course, it has seeds inside, and technically it is the category berry. The reason for that is berries are soft and fleshy. Cucumber is. I always think that you can bite into the whole thing. You can pretty much eat the whole thing. There's no core or pit inside, and there's several seeds. So a cucumber is a really good example of a biological berry, a category of fruit. A watermelon is a berry. A banana is a berry. Think of others that fit that definition. You can cut all the way through it without hitting a core or a pit, has lots of seeds, and it's soft and fleshy. So a pomme, and that comes from the French word for apple, is a great example of that, a pomme. So apples are mostly fleshy. They can have several seeds inside, but they have a hard core inside, not a pit, but a core. So everyone knows what an apple core looks like. A pear would be another example of a pomme. The third is the drupe, and a peach or a plum would be a good example of a drupe. They have a single hard woody pit inside and are usually very soft and fleshy. So if you think about all the fruits and vegetables that you eat, plants that you eat, first ask yourself, is it a fruit? What would be some vegetables that you might eat that isn't a fruit? I'm thinking of broccoli. Is broccoli a fruit? Actually, no. Broccoli is the bud of a flower. And if you ever grow broccoli and let it grow long enough, you'll see the part that you eat turns into a yellow flower. So it's actually a bud. What about a carrot? It's actually a root. So to be a fruit, it has to contain seeds. A tomato is a fruit. Cucumber is a fruit. An olive is a fruit. Another thing that surprised me when I started teaching this lab is that things that we regard as berries, like strawberries and raspberries, are technically, if you're a biologist, not berries at all. They're conglomerate fruits. You don't need to know that, but definitely know the definition of the three categories of fruits that we talked about, drupe, pomme, and berry, and be able to find an example or identify an example of each of those. And you will find that berries, such as the cucumber, are very, very common in biology. Why are animals attracted to apples when they're ripe? So if you eat a green apple, it'll probably give you a stomach ache. The reason that's unappealing is because the seed is not yet mature. So when the seed matures, the apple ripens and turns red and it gets sweet. Many people think that the apple itself serves as fertilizer for the growing plant, but it really doesn't. Biologists believe that it's simply there to attract animals to eat it. So if there were no animals in the world, there would be no such fruits that are meant for animals to consume. I think that's a really neat concept. Without animals, there would be no fruit like an apple or a cucumber, and the maturation coincides with when it becomes appealing to the animal. The other thing, you've probably heard that apple seeds have cyanide in them, and they do, tiny amounts, and they also taste very bitter. So it wouldn't work if an animal ate the fruit and crunched the seed and destroyed it, because the baby plant or the embryo is in that seed. So the fact that the seed doesn't taste good encourages the animal not to actually crunch the seed, but to swallow it whole. And then it's pooped out in a nice little pile of fertilizer, so it's a really nice system. So with that, I think we have completed the lab. So there we have it.